Hey, it's Dr. Thompson. In this presentation, I'll be discussing the physiology of pain, which is chapter 2 in your Starkey book. And I anticipate that in this 15-minute presentation, I will get to approximately a third of the information that we want to cover in this chapter and about this topic. The learning outcomes for this presentation are to explain the basic principles of the physiological and psychological reactions to pain, explain the basic role of pain, describe and differentiate between the pain control theories, and explain and demonstrate pain assessment. This is all of the learning outcomes for the whole unit on pain, and in this presentation I expect to mainly focus on explaining the basic principles of the physiological and psychological reactions to pain. So first, let's consider what pain actually is. It's described by the International Association for the Study of Pain as an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience associated with actual or potential tissue damage, or described in terms of such damage. So there's some key concepts in here. There's a sensory aspect to pain, which would be, if you would imagine, pricking your finger with a pin, with a stick pin. There's an unpleasant sensation that occurs, and that happens because a pain signal is transmitted from the fingertip all the way to the brain, and your brain's like, hey, that hurt. You also have an emotional experience, and the emotional experience and the sensory experience can change depending on a lot of different circumstances. Also, in this definition, there is the concept of actual or potential tissue damage. So we can be experiencing pain when there's potential tissue damage or when there is actual. Another thing to consider is that pain is individual. It is highly variable both within individuals and between individuals. It is affected by things like mood, culture, and past experiences, as well as by age and personality. So then let's talk about pain versus nociception. So pain, just sort of generally speaking, is an unpleasant sensation. We don't understand that it's an unpleasant sensation until a signal is transmitted to the brain, specifically in the cerebrum. Nociception, on the other hand, is a neural process of encoding and processing noxious stimuli. So nociception, then, is the neurophysiological process that may be interpreted as pain. This is the impulse that's traveling. This is the nociception. So someone that has a spinal cord injury may lack nociception in limbs, the distal limbs or the proximal limbs or both, so arms, legs, or both. And that is because there has been nerve damage. Okay. All right, dimensions of pain perception. The cerebral cortex, so the basic unit of your cerebrum, alters a person's perception and their reaction to pain. So the cerebral cortex then can kind of modify a person's reaction to pain. Pain perception, again, varies from person to person and from day to day in the same person. Consider that we may have this thing in athletics called battlefield conditions. An athlete who is so focused on the competition that when the injury occurs, the athlete may not recognize the magnitude of the injury. Okay? We sometimes think about it as there's so much adrenaline that the patient doesn't realize that they have experienced an injury. Let's then talk about pain threshold and pain tolerance. So in pain threshold, you have a level of noxious stimulus that is required to alert an individual to a potential threat to a tissue. So this really is related to that physiological response to pain. A delta fibers, so we talk about different detection, different types of nerve endings, if you will. A delta fibers are the ones that carry painful information. So stimulation of an A delta fiber results in your brain perceiving that there is a pain sensation somewhere in your brain. So when we talk about pain threshold, what we're saying is how much stimulus, what level of stimulus does it take to activate an A delta fiber, to cause a nerve impulse transmission over an A delta fiber. Now, pain tolerance then is a measure of how much pain a person can or will withstand before they withdraw from that pain. So you may know that something hurts, but you may not immediately withdraw from it. You may decide that you can put up with the pain, and how much pain you're going to tolerate depends on a number of different factors. So if you recall our discussion about different tissue types, different nerve types is what I mean to say, you'll remember that we talked about A delta fibers and C fibers and A alpha fibers. Okay. So what I was mentioning is these different types of neurons. All right. So this is in the chapter 1 in the inflammation chapter. We were comparing different tissue types, different types of neurons. There we go. All right. So what I was just referring to is that these A alphas, let's just look right here at these axons. We have type A, AA, or 1A rather, and 1B. Then we have our A betas, our A deltas, and our Cs. Okay. So if you see this type of information that's being transmitted, the A deltas are temperature sensitive. They also respond to sharp pain, and they move relatively quickly compared to the Cs. So A deltas and Cs are transmitting temperature and pain. A deltas are sharp pain, and the C fibers are dull pain. The C fibers are much slower, they're much smaller in diameter, and they're much slower as far as their rate of transmission. So then I also mentioned a second ago the A alpha fibers, which is your skeletal muscle neuron. So that's the job of an A alpha neuron, is to make a muscle contract. And the diameter of those compared to your sensory neurons is relatively large, and the conduction rate is very quick. Okay, so let's exit out of that and go back to our presentation, and I'll explain why I was talking about that. Okay, so where the pain threshold is primarily involving the A delta fibers being stimulated, pain tolerance is thought to be more highly correlated with how your C fibers are functioning. Okay, so a high level of C fiber, of neurons that are type C, are going to, when a bunch of those are stimulated, or the more of those that are stimulated, the less pain tolerance a person is going to have. It's going to make it a really obnoxious kind of pain. So pain tolerance is associated with those C fibers, and the A delta is again associated with pain threshold. So then pain threshold and pain tolerance are two different things, and they're not closely related. They're not strongly correlated at all. Okay. All right. So as I was mentioning before, influences on pain perception could include past experience. This is not new information. When we talk to patients about their pain, we ask them what's the worst pain they've ever felt. It could be related to the patient's expectations. If they feel like a particular modality is going to hurt them, if it starts hurting a little bit because they're expecting it to hurt, then their pain perception may be amplified. Sociocultural issues. It may be appropriate in some cultures to express feelings of pain very openly, and in other cultures it may be considered inappropriate to show that you are experiencing pain. So you have to consider that when you're dealing with, when you're practicing athletic training in various cultures. Personality, age, and gender are also thought to be related to pain perception. All right, so next let's talk about your somatosensory system. So this is your body's sensory system that receives input from receptors in the periphery that is then transmitted to the higher centers in your brain. And again, imagine that you prick your finger with a pin, a straight stick pin, and the result is that somewhere in your cerebrum, there's an interpretation that there is pain in your finger. Okay, so it goes from your skin in that case. So we're talking about, when you're talking about the periphery, by and large, the best example of peripheral pain would be something that injures the skin. That's one of the main roles of the skin, is to sense pain as far as comparing the body's relationship to the environment. So did you bump into something? Did something bump into you? And what sort of signal did that stimulate to be sent to your brain? All right, so the somatosensory system then provides feedback regarding potentially injurious forces, like I was just talking about. Did you run into something with your knee, and is that causing you pain? Did you hit your funny bone? Did you prick your finger with something like a sharp pin? So we need to understand a little bit how our somatosensory system works. Okay, so let's discuss this in terms of the types of neurons that are in our somatosensory system. Our specialized sensory receptors are described in your book as first-order neurons, second-order neurons, and higher centers from there. So we could say that they were third order. The first-order neurons are peripheral nerves. Okay, so the peripheral nerve then runs from the distal aspect. So if I'm imagining right now that I pricked my left index finger on the distal phalange, and that the nerve is stimulated, the peripheral nerve goes from the tip of my finger then all the way to the spinal nerve root, which exists just outside of the spinal cord. Okay, so we know that as far as the first order neurons, those afferents go into the dorsal horn, and then they do a couple of different things that are a little complex, and that's going to be one of the key concepts for us to learn about in this unit. So what happens to these first order neurons is that they synapse with second order neurons. So it's kind of like the impulse is taking this sort of windy train route, if you will, that is direct in its own way, but it has to go around a few things, and it kind of wanders into that dorsal horn. And then on the dorsal horn, there's going to be a synapse with a second order neuron that it transmits that stimulus up the spinal cord, which I've always sort of envisioned that as being like taking the elevator. And sometimes the elevator is really fast, like the express elevator. So it's taking the elevator up through your spinal cord to the higher centers in the brain. So when we're talking about higher centers, we're talking about your cerebral cortex, the amygdala, and then the sensory homunculus. So the homunculus is a really interesting thing. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. You can actually map out in your cerebrum the areas of the brain that are responsible for sensation of particular parts of your body. So if I stick my left index finger with a pin, that's going to be perceived in the homunculus at a particular part. And then if I stuck that same pin in my big toe, like just pricked it a little bit, that would be mapped out, if you will, or that sensation, that impulse goes to a different part of the cerebrum. That's a different location of the sensory homunculus. All right. So we're going to talk more about the homunculus as we go forward. So we got our first order, second order neurons, important concept to understand. And those first order neurons, those peripheral nerves, are first stimulated by receptors that are located in the skin. Okay, so looking at our model of the skin, which we have seen before as far as the three layers, the epidermal layer, which is on the top, the dermal layer, and then the subcutaneous tissue. What is depicted in this illustration are the free nerve endings, okay, that are pain receptors, free nerve endings that are temperature receptors. Those are very closely related organisms, and the sensations are they're transmitted in primarily the same ways. You have a Merkel's disc, which is a touch receptor, a Ruffinian corpuscle, which is a pressure receptor, a Meissner corpuscle, which also senses touch, and then a Pacinian corpuscle. And I will tell you a little bit about each one of those. All right, so let's look more closely then at these sensors, the sensory units in your skin. The free nerve endings are capable of sensing both pain and temperature, and they are relatively quick and relatively sensitive, so they transmit impulses quickly. They have a low threshold, which means that they fire fairly easily. The Merkel's discs are sensitive to low threshold mechanical pressure. So if you walk by a table and you brush your hand against the table, you're going to activate a Merkel's disc. Now, the Merkel discs are slow to adapt to stimuli, which means that they will continue to fire with the same amount of stimulus or with a constant stimulus. That makes them different than the Meissner corpuscle, which is a touch receptor that is quick to adapt. So your Meissner corpuscle, if you imagine just putting one hand on top of the other and pushing down, eventually your Meissner corpuscle will stop firing. It adapts quickly to that pressure, and it no longer causes a nerve ending to be stimulated. Okay, so Merkel's discs are slow to adapt, which means that they would keep sending signals, they would keep firing. Meissner corpuscles adapt quickly. So in order to keep a Meissner corpuscle activated or continuing to send impulses, you would actually have to have some vibration, some movement, some change in the pressure in order for it to be recognizing that there's still a object touching it, or that there is pressure on it. The Pacinian corpuscles, as you see, are located deeper in the skin. This is them right here. and they react to higher levels of mechanical pressure, so they're not as sensitive as the